just recently joined our program here with the School of Marine Science and Engineering as a postdoc research assistant just this past November. Her research during her bachelor's at MIT and PhD at Cornell and her postdoctoral fellowship at the University of Idaho involved laboratory investigation of environmental flow structure interactions and turbulence impacting mass and momentum transport. Katie is particularly interested in quantifying fluxes of mass as gases or solids at air, water, and water sediment interfaces of marginal aquatic systems with implications for future climate outcomes and resilience. So please give a warm welcome to Dr. Katie Katherine.
Thanks for the introduction. Happy spring semester. I'm excited to share with you some of my past work and hopefully spark some ideas for collaborations or potential insights from you all. I focus on environmental fluid mechanics and I study them in laboratory experiments. And today I'll focus on specifically interfacial fluxes and especially air-water gas transfer. But before I get into that, this is what I'm planning to work on here. I'm looking at sediment fluxes, which are really important for understanding nearshore erosion and potential flooding risks and vegetation habitats and things. And we're interested in looking at how these bed forms that form near shore are impacted or how we can model them using wave parameters in complex conditions like asymmetrical waves and wave and current forcing together. And I'll be using acoustic Doppler velocimetry, particle image velocimetry, pressure reconstruction, and stereo imaging. So if you're interested in those techniques, it'd be cool to talk about them sometime. But for today, I'll focus on my past work. I will talk first about how secondary currents impact air-water gas transfer, then about how these little bow waves impact air-water gas transfer, and then finally some of my postdoc work was looking at the flux between the water and a riverbed and looking at how bottom roughness elements affect that. Yeah, so I'll spend most of the time talking about air-water gas transfer today. But yeah, let me know if you have questions about anything else. Air-water gas transfer is important for aquatic ecosystems. It's often a limiting step in supplying nutrients or removing contaminants to promote productivity. Even in industrial aquaculture, like in these algae ponds, you have photosynthetic algae that are consuming carbon dioxide and producing oxygen. But if they're doing that at a faster rate than the air-water gas transfer, it's going to limit your productivity. And we care about algae production because it can actually be a very efficient source of fuel, biofuel. For instance, in order to supply enough fuel for the transportation sector, roughly, it would take the area of West Virginia to do that with corn biofuel, and it would take the area of Washington, D.C. to do that with algae biofuel. Besides this sort of industrial application, we're interested in air-sea gas transfer or like environmental gas transfer because it's linking these huge greenhouse gas reservoirs, mainly the atmosphere and the ocean is the largest one we think about, and this is relevant to this group. So the ocean is taking up more and more carbon dioxide and becoming more acidified, and this is affecting the marine biology and affecting atmospheric greenhouse gas levels, and so it's important to be able to predict and understand these fluxes. This is also important in other water bodies like rivers, which actually cover a large part of the earth and are working sort of against in the opposite direction. We have oceans taking in about 11 gigatons worth of CO2, like the global warming potential of 11 gigatons of CO2, whereas rivers are emitting global warming potential and lakes are also emitting global warming potential. on a smaller but still very significant scale. So it's very important to understand these fluxes and what's controlling them. And as you might have seen, some of these values have a big range because there's still a lot of uncertainty in how to estimate these fluxes. So yeah, our estimates for lakes and rivers are very uncertain, and in the ocean it's like 20% accuracy. And a big part of that is how we estimate the gas transfer velocity, which I'll talk more about later. But you can see we have these parameterizations to estimate flux based on wind speed. And we have a lot of data and decent accuracy sort of in these middle wind speeds. But then when you go to the really high wind speeds where you have breaking waves, or if you go to low wind speeds where you have like the onset of waves, we have less accuracy. So I'm interested in those areas. And the reason we need new parameterizations to estimate flux is because directly measuring flux can be really challenging. In both lakes and the ocean, you can use eddy covariance towers to estimate the flux. You could use dual tracer releases, or you can use these floating chambers, which are a control volume where you can directly measure the change in mass coming from the water, the change in mass of your gas. But the challenges with these is you can't get enough spatial or temporal coverage with the amount of resources that we have. So we need parameterizations that can use like remote satellite data or the data we're already collecting at a higher resolution in order to make these estimates. In order to do that, we have sort of this general description of flux. So flux is the change, is the mass per area going through the surface. So we parameterize it in terms of the gas transfer velocity, K, which is like a reaction rate, times the difference in concentration between sort of your saturated value, which it's approaching, and the bulk value in the mixed liquid. And the region where you have the gradient between those two is the concentration boundary layer, and its thickness can control the rate of flux as well. So one way to describe K, which is sort of the physical mechanisms that affect flux, is based on your renewal time scale. So there are turbulent motions bringing parcels from the bulk fluid near the surface where you have a higher contrast in concentration, and higher gradients lead to more flux. And the sort of frequency of those renewal events is going to be related to the flux. So K scales with the square root of the molecular diffusivity over the renewal time. But now the question is, how do we parameterize that renewal time? What metric best describes these motions that are causing mixing, that are key to the flux? So we can look at the ratio between relevant time scales. First, there's the Batchelor time scale, which is basically the smallest fluctuation you can get in the concentration before molecular diffusion is going to like wash it out. And then you have your largest eddy scales, which are the energy containing scales, and it's based on the integral length scale and the turbulence intensity. So those are your large eddies. And then you have your smallest scales of motion, which is the Kolmogorov scale. And that's the smallest momentum fluctuation you can get before viscosity takes over. So we want to know, is it the large eddies or the small eddies that are actually causing the mixing? And it's related to the ratios of these time scales. So if we look at the ratio of the large and small scales, then we get this, we get the turbulence Reynolds number, which is like your typical Reynolds number, but based on your turbulence, the velocity scale of your turbulence intensity. And we get the Schmidt number, which is relating your diffusion of the gas itself, your molecular diffusion, and the diffusion of momentum, basically, which is your kinematic viscosity. And it's interesting that for mobile surfaces like these, the gas transfer velocity scales with the Schmidt number to the -1/2, which is what we got here from the ratio of these time scales. So this is like saying how much mixing is being done by the smallest eddies based on their relationship with the smallest concentration gradients, because the motions that are going to mix the concentration plume instead of stirring it should be on a similar scale. All right, so if we have a high turbulence Reynolds number, then we use the small eddy model because the large eddies are just going to stir the concentration, basically. So we get, if we plug in the Kolmogorov scale for the renewal time scale, we get this equation, but it has an empirical constant. And analytically, we can predict that should be 0.36. Empirically, it's often found to be around 0.41, but it does vary a lot. And sometimes it's found that it can depend on these other variables like the TKE dissipation rate or the turbulence intensity. So we want to better understand how to get this constant. Another model that's used, that's connected to the renewal time scale, is the surface divergence model. So you think of the scales of a vertical fluctuation in velocity being the renewal event, and it has some length scale, delta z, and some velocity scale, w prime, and that is essentially the surface divergence. So we can get this model where by plugging the inverse of the surface divergence in for your renewal time, and again you get this empirical constant which has a range, and we want to better understand this. So one complex flow I was looking at that in order to test these different models and try to better understand them is these secondary currents, which are kind of long roller vortices, and they're enhanced in this case by bed ridges that go along a flume. So flow is in the long direction with these ridges, but then you get these upwelling over the ridges and downwelling between them, and you get a lot of divergence over the bars or ridges. And these are similar to Langmuir cells, which you get in the ocean if you see like strips of bubbles or seaweed that can be caused by these long roller vortices. So we're interested in how this affects the homogeneity of gas transfer or enhances gas transfer. So these are points where velocity was measured in situ with an ADV, and this is the resulting velocity for 3 flow cases, 3 flow speeds. So you can see the downwelling between ridges going towards the bars, and then it's going to go up. And for my analysis, I focused on these points and found that the small eddy model worked well, but also some sort of large eddy models worked well based on the ADV data. But then also we looked at the surface velocity field, so we can look at surface divergence and more spatial variety and surface values of the velocity. So this gives us a 2D velocity field at the surface covering 4 of the bed ridges. Here you can see the surface divergence values for the 3 flow cases. So you can see over the ridges, there's a region of high divergence, which is what we would expect. And it increases with flow speed. So in the results, I mentioned values from the peak region, inflection point, and trough. That's talking about if we look at velocity laterally, we have this kind of wave due to the ridges. So I'm looking at values along this wave. Here we're looking at estimates of K now in the lateral direction. So there's a spike over the ridges, and then it decreases between the ridges. And you can see there's a very significant variation. So if you were just measuring gas transfer at one point between these, you would get a bias because you need a larger coverage to get the true average. And here's sort of smoothing this out in 2D with the superimposed with sort of the secondary currents to give you another picture of how you get high gas transfer in the divergence zone and then lower gas transfer in the convergence zone. Here's a new method I applied that's sort of combining a surface divergence method and the spectral method for getting the dissipation rate in the small eddy model. So instead of just looking at the mean surface divergence value, I look at the basically variance in the energy spectrum in the inertial subrange where it seems to plateau, and use that to estimate gas transfer. So here's a comparison of different models for cases without the bed ridges, and in this case the small eddy model with like a slightly different approach to get the TKE dissipation rate using the structure function was most effective, but also this new method was also pretty effective for these three cases. And then the case with ridges, the new method was the most accurate. So the takeaway from these experiments is that these vortices cause a lot of lateral variation, and then there's these new parameterizations that could be more accurate, but there needs to be further comparison, I think. Now we ask, what's another way we could modify gas transfer velocity by modifying the concentration boundary layer? Again, this is sort of our picture of the flow. We want to modify this near surface gradient. And the answer is steep waves, and specifically short waves, or capillary waves, are going to be very steep because of surface tension. So here you can see sort of an analytical model of the surface of a capillary wave with different amplitudes. So in the trough, there's a lot of straining and it thins the concentration boundary layer. And so based on this model, they expected a threefold enhancement in gas transfer, but then in experiments where they vertically vibrated a tank of water to create a Faraday instability, they got a 2-order magnitude increase in gas transfer. So these have a very significant impact. They can be utilized to optimize aquaculture gas transfer, or we would like to better understand their role in the environment. And the gas transfer increases with mean squared slope. Like we said, we want steep waves, steep short waves. So how do we do that on a large scale? Or like in the lab on a large scale and consider where it occurs in the environment? We think of something like bow waves, but where might you see bow waves on the smaller scale? What about in front of a duck? If you get, if you have the waves, if you're at a sufficiently high speed to generate waves and it's still subcritical, so you can have waves going upstream of the object, then you get these capillary gravity bow waves that are on the order of millimeters or centimeter. And so these are affected by surface tension and they'll be steep, and we're interested in how they affect gas transfer. So in order to do that on a large, across the whole surface of a flume, we have an array of hanging dowels that are kind of doing the same thing as the duck, but with the water flowing past them. So here's the flume where those, oh well, that's okay. This is the flume where the experiments were conducted. So you can see there's pretty good wave coverage and we're just curious how at different velocities these will affect gas transfer rate. So these green squares represent the gas transfer rate at different flow speeds without any dowels, and the blue is with dowels. So once we hit the minimum phase speed, here you start to see a bigger divergence, a bigger increase or enhancement due to those waves as velocity increases. Here there's a 60% increase due to the gas transfer velocity. And up here it's sort of spiked in this area. So one explanation for that spike is looking at the bubbles that come off of the dowels due to vortex-induced vibration. Yeah, so there is a video, but it's not working. So there, you can kind of see the bubble there as the dowels vibrate back and forth. There's a low pressure downstream of the dowel that brings down the water surface and it pinches off and you get a bubble, and bubbles are very efficient at air-water gas transfer. So whenever everything I've been talking to you about is like pretty much without bubbles. Once you throw bubbles into it, it really complicates things because they're very efficient. Here is the gas transfer enhancement as a function due to the dowels as a function of velocity. So it's roughly quadratic, but the fit is r squared 0.86. So then we were interested in looking at how the relative velocity between the dowel and the water affects the gas transfer, because the higher relative velocity gives us shorter waves that we want. But we didn't want to have a really high flow speed in the bulk flow, because then just boundary shear turbulence, it would be generating a lot of gas transfer as well. So we want to have a slow bulk flow and a high relative speed. So I built this conveyor. None of the videos are working. Anyway, that's fine. Is that a setting? Oh well. The dowel slate is like a motor here with a pulley system, and it just drags the dowels upstream, so you get a higher relative speed, and so you can get steep waves like this, but with a slow bulk speed. Okay, so now we have the same plot, the same base plot as before, but now with the conveyed dowel results. Let's see. So here are all the cases with the 5 centimeters per second bulk speed, but then as you add conveyor belt speed, the gas transfer gets higher and higher. So the difference between this value and these values is an increase of 600%. And then, yeah, this one is also due to the conveyor. So now we can look at the enhancement as a function of relative speed with the same bulk speed, and again it's increasing possibly quadratically, but we might want more data points to be sure. And part of the trick in understanding what the effect will be is we don't know, as far as I know, we don't have a way to know what the steepness of the waves will be as a function of the flow speed. We know that for gravity waves, we have like these models for gravity bow waves, but this is an analytical. This is an analytical solution for the elevation field around a disturbance that creates capillary gravity bow waves, where the disturbance is modeled as like a constant drawdown in the water surface. And but there's still some unknown values, like this F0 term. So if we could measure the water surface directly around these bow waves, then we could determine that F0 term and then just model what we expect to happen. Okay, now I'm jumping into my postdoc work, which is looking at a completely different interface. So I did some work there looking at air-water interface, but a lot of what they do the University of Idaho is interested in how nutrients are transported into a granular bed, because that's going to affect the river quality, which affects fish and other wildlife, but also affects the greenhouse gas emissions from the river, which can be exacerbated by fertilizer runoff. So for these experiments, we're considering river conditions kind of like these in Hawaii. We have these sort of artificial hemisphere boulders and a gravel bed flume. And we looked at different bed conditions. So there's the flat bed with a boulder, and then boulder with boulder-induced topography, where you have like a strong flow, transport sediment around the boulder and deposit it so that you have sort of steeper topography around the boulder. And this color scale indicates the amount of oxygen we measured in the bed. We directly measured it with DO sensors. And so adding the boulders enhanced gas uptake into the bed, but the topography had an even stronger impact, and we can see that in this plot here. So if you go right to left in this plot, you're getting steeper topography around the boulder. Like this case is flat, and then you get more and more sediment transport around the boulder. And the left and right side are for like a low flow rate and a high flow rate. So you can see as you get more topography, you're getting more oxygen in the bed. So that's really important for what we call the hyperic zone and organisms in the hyperic zone, which is the saturated stream bed. And one other project I got to help out with a little bit, but is based at Colorado State University, is looking at how we can use the wave dispersion equation, which you're probably familiar with from the ocean in rivers, to estimate river flow or discharge. So the waves of interest are undulate hydraulic jumps, which can form behind an obstruction or a contraction as the flow approaches a supercritical state. And then those can be seen in large rapids you can see them from satellite images. So based on that, they looked at the wavelength of these undulate hydraulic jumps and can use the wave dispersion to calculate the velocity and then assumptions about the Froude number in combination with that, to estimate the discharge. And there are some challenges with it, because in the past they used the deep water assumption, so you have the deep water form of the wave dispersion equation for the phase speed, and they considered how the sort of full dispersion equation would compare with the deep assumption, like how much of an effect does the deep assumption have. And it's interesting that because as you approach the critical Froude number, as you are in the jump, this result is going to give you a zero depth, because you can't have waves pass in a supercritical condition. So it's very sensitive in this region to the Froude number, what you assume the Froude number to be, because you're rapidly approaching zero. But if they got decent results if you assume the Froude number is 0.85, because then that gives you this H on L value. That's not zero. But in the past they would use a Froude number assumption of 1, so obviously that wouldn't work with the full dispersion equation. So if you have insights on interpreting wave dispersion in rivers, let me know. And this work is in review, so keep an eye out for it if you're interested. All right, in summary, looking at different mechanisms that affect air-water gas transfer, found that the secondary currents cause a lot of inhomogeneity in gas transfer, so it's important to get enough spatial coverage when you're estimating gas transfer, and that these sort of new approaches to parameterizing it seem to work pretty well. Then looking at capillary gravity bow waves have a big effect on gas transfer. So that could be used in aquaculture or be relevant if you have vegetation creating bow waves. And then this enhancement was dependent on velocity as you get shorter waves and possibly wake effects. And then looking at how macro roughness elements and their induced topography affect oxygen going into the riverbed and affecting hyporheic zones and how oxic they are, we found that the topography around the boulders is really important to consider. And then just a quick plug for, there's a PhD position at the University of Idaho. They're interested in a student who wants to look at ice transport in rivers. So if you know anyone who's looking for a PhD position, can share that with them. Are there any questions?
Yeah, I was curious about the fluid dynamics of why you get capillary waves and example like the duck, or I'm not sure if you're saying that's as opposed like you get a smaller scale as opposed to like a boat or something. Why do you get capillary waves instead of a gravity wave in that situation?
That's a great question. I think, yeah, it's partly the scale. I have a slide here with a bit more info about, I know these are working. This one works. I guess the others are. Anyway, so you still have gravity waves as well. They just show up downstream. But yeah, I think it's like with boats, they're going too fast for the waves to propagate in front of them. But the maximum speed for capillary waves is a little different from gravity waves, but also they're just so small, like even if they were there, you wouldn't notice. Like you'd probably have parasitic waves, capillary waves around there, the bow of a boat. But yeah, like you don't get the gravity waves propagating upstream of a boat typically because it's going faster than square root GH, or faster than the waves, right? So you get the Kelvin angle. I don't know, maybe others have insights. Thanks.
Did you ever have to deal with errors introduced by temperature variations in your lab experiments?
Yeah, that's a great question. So we had to correct for temperature. All the values I showed were corrected. All the, like these values are corrected to be equivalent at 20 degrees Celsius because it did vary in the lab between I think like 18 and 22 maybe. So not huge differences, but we use the Schmidt number to do that. So I'm trying to go back to the Schmidt number scaling. Yeah, here, so we know that K scales with the Schmidt number to the -1/2, and the Schmidt number is just based on the viscosity and the molecular diffusivity. So if you know the molecular diffusivity and viscosity at that temperature, then you can correct your gas transfer based on that. You have a good question.
I'm kind of curious. So you had the flume set up for the capillary waves. When you were using the flume, did you ever have like air trapped in the pipes that introduced error into your measurements? And if so, how did you handle that?
I feel like once the flume had been going for a while, we didn't really see any bubbles coming out. So based on that, we assumed not. But another issue that could affect the surface tension results is if you have surfactants. So skimming the surfactants off is important. But yeah, with the bubbles, we only really noticed bubbles when we got the vortex-induced vibration causing bubbles. So I don't think there are bubbles in the pipes, but yeah, there's no other way to tell. Yeah, good question.
Thank you for this presentation. That was amazing. I have just a quick question. How would you model the effects of climate change on the ratio between the RC flux ratio?
Yeah, I guess one effect is if you have more storms or higher wind speeds typically and more breaking waves, you'll get a faster flux, which would lead to more CO2 uptake, more acidification in that case. And then in rivers and lakes, if it affects the water level or the flow discharge, that would affect the amount of greenhouse gases, the rate of emitting greenhouse gases, and if the warmer climate also increases biological activity, that could affect how much the gases are being produced or consumed. So yeah, it's a good question. It's a little complicated, but yeah, I think the wind speed changes are key. The fact that it's warmer too would change your relevant Schmidt number. So you get faster flux at a higher temperature.
Temperature question is me asking, what thinking about like for your setup, were you able to tell if there was a consistent air temperature above versus like from the water column in your tank, or because I know that having things in labs, like temperature could be a real pain in the butt, like especially like this time of year, you're like, oh, it's perfectly fine, and then suddenly, oh, you weren't expecting this stratification and you're thinking a small amount of water to start occurring, so we have to.
Yeah, that's a great question. We just measured temperature in the water, and just kind of at one point where it was well mixed. But I would be curious. I think because we left the water in the room, like we didn't often bring in fresh water. Fresh water probably is colder, but it was usually in the lab for a while and would equilibrate, and the lab was decently controlled. So I think also those experiments take hours to measure the gas transfer rate. So during that time, hopefully it equilibrated, but yeah, that would be a good thing to check, is like, it'd be great to see like the temperature gradient and see if there's like a skin cooling effect or anything that would change results. Yeah, that's a great question. Thanks.
What was your method of getting the convergence and divergence zone from on the surface, especially the image that you showed?
The camera?
Yeah.
Oh, no, that's it. Yep, so there's it's like I think it's called Bobcat scientific camera that's just mounted directly above that region up on the ceiling. And then there was a strobe light to illuminate for a very short period, because like you can't use lasers really for the surface. So it was a strobe light system with an umbrella to help diffuse the strobe light.
Do you have glass particles on the surface to track the velocity?
Yep, it was glass seeding particles. Typical PIV. Good question.
You mentioned that one of the applications was wetlands, but the velocities that you were looking at were very fast for flow through wetlands. I was wondering if you thought this was limited to situations where you had very fast flow in wetlands, or if you thought that other aspects like wind blowing through the plants or something else could contribute to capillary waves occurring in natural wetlands. So yeah, what's sort of the applicability to where do you see this fitting into the natural world and sort of scaling up?
Yeah, that's a great question. So with wetlands or cases where you have a flow speed less than the minimum phase speed of like 28 centimeters per second or 27, if you have wind, you can definitely see that any kind of vegetation or a log or boulder that's penetrating through the surface is gonna create these ripples. So if there's enough coverage of that and a high enough wind speed for a long enough time, it would definitely have an effect. I don't know if anyone's looked at that on the wind in terms of wind and wetlands affecting gas transfer, unless they create waves. Yeah, I'd have to check into that, that's a good question. But also in like other rivers, you can have a lot of vegetation that might, or boulders that would produce these waves.
You mentioned bubbles being super efficient. What's the relative flux rates between like a system with bubbles and a system without?
It's a great question. I think, like in the algae ponds, you need to like triple the natural level of gas transfer to get the good productivity, and they do that with diffusers. So without any modification, it's at least 3 times better. But I was trying to go back to this figure. Do we know where waves start breaking at what speeds? Yeah, it's hard to say from here.
What did you say?
I guess like here with wind speed increasing, I don't know at what point you get bubbles dominating, but
Who knows?
yeah, it could be. What is it?
It's about like 8 meters per second.
Oh, 8, okay. So yeah, and here, like, so below that, you're kind of around like 10 or 11, but then once you get past that, you're getting like almost, yeah, you're getting up to like 60. So it's like six times more. Or well, but part of that's due to the kinetic energy you're adding, so in terms of efficiency, it's tough to compare like the same amount of energy going in without breaking and That's a good question.
So to follow up on that, you mentioned diffusers are used with algal farms. What do you mean by that? How are those mechanically done?
Yeah, they'll pipe in, sometimes they use air and sometimes they'll use flue gas from like a fossil fuel.
So they're artificially just diffused by air?
Yeah, they like pipe in a gas with like bubblers at the bottom. And so it's pretty expensive and a pretty serious installation. So that's why we're looking at sort of hydrodynamic approaches to enhancing it instead.
What gas is it?
CO2 is what they want.
CO2, not CO2.
Sorry?
What, more CO2, not less CO2.
For the photosynthetic algae, you do, yeah.
It's frequently the problem is too much.
To the opposite,
The
yeah.
oxygen,
I mean, it
and
works
it
the
kills
same way.
everything off,
but-
And then you kill off your algae that you just created.
Oh. Yeah, in these cases, the oxygen gets too high, so they want to get rid of the oxygen. Which I think the bubbles also help remove the oxygen, as long as they're at a low level. They get super saturated.
Were there any biologists that you worked with during this project?
No, I sort of talked to some people at I know there's people at Pacific Northwest National Lab who were actually growing the algae, and people at ASU growing algae. But I didn't really work directly with them. So that would be a good insight to know, like, or what were you thinking of any particular?
Yeah, I'm just curious what populations of algae, like how that differs for the amount of gas concentration in water. I imagine that'd be pretty significant for any kind of aquaculture farming.
Oh yeah, so you mean in terms of the nutrients they need or the oil they're producing?
Just any factors really.
Yeah, I guess for biofuel they're trying to optimize like oil production from the
Right.
algae, I guess, so looking at different strains that produce the most biofuel. But I don't know exactly what strains
How would the decreasing rates of the absorption of the carbon affect your model?
How would what of the carbon, sorry?
How would the decreasing rates of the carbon absorption by the ocean would affect your model? Would that change anything in your model, or like?
I think the gas transfer, the concentrations wouldn't affect the parameterizations I'm looking at, because they're purely based on like the physical mechanisms that affect the efficiency. So, and the concentration itself shouldn't change the results based on this model.
We have time for one more.
I have another one, somebody else doesn't.
Anyone else? Alright, so yours?
So a lot of buoys are in the ocean measuring air sea gas exchange and fluxes. Does the presence of the buoy and the interaction with the flow generate capillary waves and other waves that increase the transport where you're making the measurements? Meaning it's not really an open ocean measurement, it's close to the buoy. Is that a problem?
I think it depends on the sea state. Like if you already have a lot of waves, I don't know if if there's a strong current and you're getting like a lot, like steep capillary waves and opaque and everything, I could see it potentially affecting it, but since it's only one set of waves, like if you had a whole bunch of them together, I think it would definitely
If
affect
you had lots
it.
of waves, and
Yeah.
capillary waves on top of that because of wind, you wouldn't care about the capillary waves. The other processes would dominate.
Yeah, I think
Is that
this, yeah, I think if you already have sort of the parasitic capillary waves that you get just from the wind shear, then the bow waves on top of that might not make a big difference, but also if it's just like one buoy versus like an array of buoys, I don't know if the one buoy would make a big difference. If you're looking at an average and it's sort of mixed. Yeah, are they looking at, they must be looking at eddy covariance, right?
For the turbulence kind of things, like
Oh.
Jane does, but just the fluxes themselves, just measuring the carbon dioxide in the water and the fluxes across the boundaries are influenced by all those processes.
Yeah, I'm wondering how they measure it, because I know like eddy covariance towers are looking at a large like reach, right, of where the wind has been. So then it's sort of averaging a large area and it wouldn't affect it, but if it's something that's somehow local, like the floating chamber setup, then it would affect it more.
Right, thanks.
Thanks.
Alright, a round of applause.